Hey, welcome back to Anti-Social Studies. My name is Emily Glankler, and today for some reason I've decided that I'm gonna write the 2022 APUSH History DBQ live in front of your eyes. I don't know why. I think I woke up this morning and chose violence. Who knows? I've done a few of these other videos, but they've all been for AP World History prompts. So hopefully this will be helpful to anyone taking the AP US History exam. You can see me work through last year's DBQ live. You can see kind of my process, my strategy, how I approach things. But also, even if you're not in AP US History, if you're in AP Euro, AP World, the format is all the same. So if you find this helpful, like and subscribe, give me a nice comment, and let's go. So just to be clear, I haven't read through this prompt. I remember looking at it when the College Board released the prompts after the exam last year, but since then I haven't looked at it again. So what you're gonna see is you're gonna see me kind of work through the documents live. You're gonna see me talk through kind of how I approach the rubric, how I approach writing a DBQ, and hopefully you will learn some things from it. Hopefully it'll make you a little bit calmer when you go in to write your DBQ on the AP exam. Okay, so first, before we even get started, I wanna make sure that we're really clear on the rubric. And you can see here on my screen that obviously when you get your DBQ, the whole little packet, it's gonna come with this bullet point sort of rubric summary. Over on my writing document, which I will share down in the description, I've also just simplified the rubric in my own head, and this is something that would be really helpful for you to do, is just, you don't need to like memorize the whole thing, but at least make sure that you can pull up the like really simplistic version of how you're going to be getting points on this exam. And you'll notice I've color coded them because this is really important for understanding both the DBQ and the LEQ. The strategy here is way more about quality over quantity. It is not necessary for you or me or anyone to get all 7 points on the DBQ to do well on our AP exam. And in fact, I think it's kind of a trap. I have found that students who push themselves and try really hard to get all 7 points, they really try to get complexity. They evaluate all the documents, all that stuff. A lot of times they actually end up doing worse because you end up not doing any of the things well enough to earn the point. So my strategy is quality over quantity. I'm going to focus first on the points that I think are going to be easier for me to get. I've highlighted those in green. Those are at least my predictions. Typically, I do okay with context and thesis. It's pretty straightforward. And then I feel confident I can at least address 3 documents. That gets me a 3 out of 7 already. The average globally on these DBQs is normally somewhere between a 1, a 2, maybe a 3. So even just doing that basic DBQ, you're already setting yourself up well. Then the idea is that once I see the prompts, maybe I have an easier time with more of the documents, or once I get kind of my basic ideas down, then I look at the clock and think about, okay, how much time do I have left and what other points do I want to go for? The idea is that I'm not going to shoot for complexity unless I'm sitting here staring with nothing to write and there's like 5 minutes left in my test. You should never stop writing. You should always be adding more, because remember, they can't take points away from you. Even if you write a beautiful essay and get, let's say, all 7 points, and then you write the craziest paragraph at the end that has nothing to do with anything, they can't take those points away from you. So it never hurts to add more. But again, it's way more important that what you're writing is really good quality and that you're really fully explaining the few points that you're making, rather than just trying to like info dump every little thing that you remember about this time period. Okay, so let's go. So first, I'm going to read through the prompt and I'm going to make sure that I understand it as best I can before I jump into the documents. And I also like to kind of brainstorm potential ideas or answers before I look at the documents, if any come to mind. So they're asking me to evaluate the extent to which the United States developed a national identity between 1800 and 1855. Okay, evaluate the extent to which this thing happened is like the easiest prompt they can give you, because they're basically saying put it on a spectrum. Either it totally did happen in this way, it totally didn't happen in this way or because of this, more likely it kind of happened like this, but it kind of didn't happen like this. That's all they're asking you, right? So evaluate the extent just means once I look at the documents, I'm going to decide what is my argument. Am I going to say, yes, by 1855, we had like a fully unified national identity? Or am I going to say, no, we were not unified. We didn't have a core identity at all. We were scattered all over the place. Most likely, I'm going to say it's a little bit of both. So for US history, I'm going to just brainstorm what era we're in. This is where a little bit of memorization can go a long way, whether that's like the presidents or just a few different years or whatever. So I'm just going to make sure that my head is like situated in the right era. So I know election of 1800 was Jefferson. So what we're talking about here is we're talking about Jefferson, and then we're talking about like the War of 1812, and then we're talking about the whole Jackson years, and it goes all the way up to 1855. So we're talking about like the Mexican-American War, and all the way up to like the Compromise of 1850 kind of stuff. So again, this is mostly Unit 4, but it meanders into Unit 5 too. So I just kind of want to get my head straight. It doesn't really matter what you write on this page. You're just making sure that you're situating yourself and you're not going to these documents thinking that we're talking about the Revolution or thinking that we're talking about the Gilded Age. We're talking about this like early Republic era where we're gaining land through the Louisiana Purchase, through the Mexican-American War, whatever. And also we have this like Jacksonian democracy. We're also having these arguments about slavery, but we're not to the Civil War yet. So I can't talk about the Civil War in this. That'd be outside the time period. Okay, so let's see. Did we develop a national identity? So looking at document 1, I'm going to take just really brief notes. And this is what I would do too on like, if you're handwriting, I would take it on the packet. It's a map. Anytime you have a visual, read the source information and read any of the keys or anything like word for word. That should be the first thing you do, because honestly, the map is at that point probably not going to be super helpful. Like you'll get most of what you need from just like the source information. So this is showing the year of the removal of property qualifications for white male suffrage. So I know that this is talking about white male suffrage, no more property requirements. I'm already kind of vaguely familiar with the thing that happened. This says, based on this map, most of the states by 1850 are gone. They don't have that anymore. Gone by 1850, except for North Carolina. So it looks like based on this key, North Carolina is the only state that still has a property qualification for voting by 1850. Okay, great. Keep in mind, I don't need to figure out what this whole thing means just yet. What I'm literally doing is just grabbing the gist, the basic overview of the document. Then I'm going to sit back and kind of zoom out and go, okay, what do these things have to do with national identity? What happens with a lot of students is they get really hung up on trying to understand every single part of a document. And so you'd spend 5 more minutes here trying to figure out the point of view and trying to figure out how exactly to apply it to the prompt. You don't need to do that yet. Get through all of them and look at them, and then you'll have a much better time going through and kind of sorting them and figuring out what you want to do. Okay, document 2 is a report or manifesto of the causes and reasons of war with Great Britain, produced 1812. Okay, so we're talking about War of 1812, causes. Again, I always read the source information word for word, and then I skim the document, because remember, I'm just looking for evidence that relates to national identity. So that's where remembering kind of those key words of the prompt can be really helpful for skimming the documents, because I don't need to read this document to understand every cause of the War of 1812. In fact, I might already know most of them. All I'm doing is I'm scanning through this document to try to pick out potential evidence that could give me some sort of argument about our national identity, whether we have one or we don't. Maybe we're in a lot of disagreement. Okay. After great injustice, British government, violence, oppression, avenge the wrongdoings, vindicate the rights and honor of the nation. That's kind of national identity-ish. The effect produced by this attack on the lawful commerce might have been expected from a virtuous, independent, and highly injured people, but one sentiment pervaded the whole American nation. Okay, here we go. One sentiment pervaded the whole American nation. No local interests were regarded, no sordid motives felt. Without looking to the parts which suffered most, the invasion of our rights was considered a common cause. Okay, great. So what they're saying is like, the honor of the nation thing doesn't actually really, that's not gonna be very helpful to me. One sentiment pervaded the whole American nation. So what they're saying is the attack on lawful commerce was seen as an attack on all Americans, not just trading businesses, not just kind of the East Coast. Basically what this argument is saying, Committee on Foreign Relations, which is going to be biased, we can talk about that later. What they're arguing is, hey, even though like the cause of this war might be kind of economic and very specifically about the economic interests of some groups like merchants, that we as one American nation felt like it was an attack on all of us because we now have this unified national identity. I'm going to call BS. I don't think that's actually true, but that's what this document says. That's what the government wants them to think about going to war. Great. So I'm going to make a little note here, by the way. I'm going to say like point of view or intended audience, maybe like purpose. And I'm just making a note for myself that like, if I have time, I should come back and look at this, the point of view or the purpose of this document. Notice I'm not going to get hung up on it yet because it's one of the harder points to get. This is what I mean. I'm going to go through and just understand the documents first, but I'm making a little reminder myself that I already had some things going in my brain about how I think this document's kind of BS. I think it's a little bit biased. We'll come back if we have time. Document 3, President James Madison, address to Congress. oh gosh, Madison to Congress in 1815. Okay, I have no idea what this is going to be about. The War of 1812 has just ended. I'm just looking for any words or phrases that have to do with national identity. That's it. Among the means of advancing the public interest, calling for the attention of Congress, of establishing throughout our country the roads and canals. Roads and canals for the public interest. Okay, I kind of already know what this is going to be about. Executed by national authority, blah, blah, blah. Nor is there any country which presents a field where nature invites more the art of man to complete her own work. These considerations are strengthened by the political effect of these facilities for intercommunication, bringing and binding more closely together. Okay, we need infrastructure to bind more closely together the nation. Oh, here we go. While the states individually, so notice I'm like really stopping if I see words that have to do with national identity, national unity, or lack thereof. So while the states individually avail themselves of their local advantages with roads and canals, basically we need big national ones. Okay, so this is the type of thing that can't just be left to each state on their own. This is something that the national government needs to take on and say, okay, we're going to build this like Cumberland Road, right? We're going to build this big Erie Canal. We're going to build eventually the Transcontinental Railroad, although that's outside of this time period. And we need to do it because we actually need to bind the states together even more. So this is a little bit more of an argument of like, we might not be fully united with one common identity yet, but this would be a way to help us get there. Goes a little bit against what document 2 is saying. Oh, we all agree on everything. We all have the same identity. Maybe not. Okay. Document 4, Constitution of the Cherokee Nation. Cherokee Constitution, 1827. All right. We, the people of the Cherokee Nation, to establish justice, blah, 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 acknowledging, okay, do ordain this Constitution. Article 1, Section 2, the lands of the Cherokee Nation shall remain common property, but the improvements to the land made are the exclusive property of the citizens respectively who made them, or provided that those citizens... Oh, wait, this is kind of weird. Okay, wait. Why did they pick this very specific section? This is saying like Cherokee lands are common property, but improvements to the land are the exclusive property of the citizens who made the improvements. Interesting. I'm not sure what to do with this one yet. This might be our weird document. There always in a DBQ is at least one weird one that kind of throws you for a loop and you're like, all right, don't know how this connects. I'm going to just come back to it. I've gotten the basics down. I have an idea, like, are they getting at that, like, national identity was infiltrating even this Cherokee Constitution? Because they're like, well, we don't have private property, but we will at least allow for private ownership of, like, bridges that you build on your property. I don't know. This one's weird. I'll come back to it. I might just skip this one if I get other ones I feel like I know better. Document 5, Maria Stewart, a free African-American woman, speech to the Anti-Slavery Society. Okay, great. Notice, like, I'm taking just enough notes at the beginning of what the document is so that hopefully I don't have to keep going back to the documents over and over again. I can kind of remind myself by looking at my notes. All right, this is in 1832. Notice these are going in chronological order, which is really helpful. The DBQ, I think, will always do that. They'll always give you the documents in chronological order, which is helpful if you want to talk about change over time or something like that. Okay, it was asserted that we were a ragged set crying for liberty. I replied, the whites have so long and so loudly proclaimed the theme of equal rights and privileges that our souls have caught the flame also. Okay, so basically, you know, Black enslaved people are crying for liberty only because white Americans have been talking about the, quote, theme of equal rights and privileges. Like, we're just following you. Like, you keep saying that that's what America's all about. So, like, yeah, that's why we're asking for it too. Okay. It's true that free people of color are neither bought nor sold, but few, if any, have an opportunity to become rich and independent. So even free Black people don't have the same opportunity as white people. Okay. But methinks our oppression is soon to come to an end. The Pilgrims, when they first landed on these shores, quietly compose themselves and say the Britons have all the money and all the power and we must continue their servants forever. No, they first made powerful efforts to raise themselves. Oh, this is really cool. Compares Black Americans to Pilgrims. And I say that because that is like hearkening back to a national identity that white people had claimed, right? So white people had claimed, oh, the Pilgrims, the Puritans, Jamestown, all that sort of stuff as a part of our national identity. And that Black Americans are attempting to claim that same history to then support their push for emancipation. That's cool. I've never seen this document before. I really like it. All right, gotta get going. Document 6. Ralph Waldo Emerson, I know him. Transcendentalism, I think. Okay, Harvard, 1837. Another sign of our times is the new importance given to the single person, individualism. New importance of individualism. The man is all, in yourself is the law of all nature, blah, blah, blah. We have listened too long to the courtly muses of Europe. The spirit of the American freeman is already suspected to be timid, imitative, and tame. See already the tragic consequence. The mind of this country, taught to aim at low objects, eats upon itself. What? What is the remedy? We will walk on our own feet. We will work with our own hands, speak with our own minds. A nation of men will for the first time exist because each believes himself. He's saying this individualism is good. Okay. New importance of individualism is going to like separate Americans from Europe as like hardworking, a kind of hard-working nation of men. Okay, we'll come back. Reverend on female education. Oh gosh. Okay. Reverend female education 1850. This is either going to be really cool or really frustrating. There has long been a standing dispute the intellectual powers of the two sexes. It is among the things settled by experience that equal or not equal in talents, woman, the moment she escapes from the despotism of brute force, shares with man the scepter of influence. By the mere force of her gentle nature, silently directs that authority and so rules the world. Where are you going, Reverend Fisher? What? And who that considers the peculiar purpose of woman's life, who that understands the meaning of those good old words, mother, sister, wife, daughter, who that estimates aright the duties they involve, the influences they embody, will hesitate to place her intellect as high in the scale of power as that of the father, husband, son? If we estimate her mind by its actual power of influence... Oh, okay, it ended well. He landed the plane. All right. If we estimate her mind by its actual power of influence when she's permitted to fill it to the best of advantage, we shall find a capacity for education equal to that of men. Oh my gosh. Women are equally capable when given the opportunity. Man, that was like a really roundabout way. I didn't really know what he was saying there. I was like, is this a rhetorical question? Are you in agreement with this or not? But that last sentence was what we really needed. He's basically arguing that like when women are given the chance, they should have equal capacity for education, and like we don't need to get into the details of his argument because frankly I don't understand it, but I understand that that's the main point he's making. Okay. Ooh, this is a hard DBQ because this is like, these are like 7 seemingly very disconnected documents. So we're gonna have to figure out what I like to do here is I like to just think about this on a spectrum. If we're gonna talk about just like divided or like different identities versus like a common identity. Let's just start there because that was really our evaluate the extent is like to what extent do we have a sort of common national identity? And then the counter would be like, we don't, we have different ones. So let me first by just kind of sorting these. So white male suffrage, the War of 1812. Okay, so document 2 is arguing we do. The whole of the American nation was mad at this attack. Document 3 could really go either way. I'm going to wait and kind of see where I need it. I don't understand document 4. Although I think it's maybe an example of, there is something that's happening here of like minorities using American identity to gain acceptance. That might be something that's happening here, in which case we could talk about the Cherokee Constitution, the free black woman, and maybe the female education one. Okay, so that might actually be a whole group. It's like, hey, there's these groups that are left out of this national identity that are actually using the same language of the national identity to be like, so let us in too. So that actually might be my argument. So maybe it's that we do have like national identity, which is of like hard-working, equal white men, right? That seems to be like a generally accepted identity, and we see that in white male suffrage in the first map. We see it in, oh, the War of 1812, everyone was mad about it. Well, we probably mean like all the fighting age, you know, guys that were going to go and fight the war, or the politicians and stuff who were going to be white men. We could even talk about in 3, like the need to strengthen this, like it's there, but we need to strengthen it. And we could also talk about Emerson's argument about like hardworking individuals. So I'm going to like put in here like individualism maybe is a key part of the identity, because then you could talk about document 3 being like need to strengthen because we are a nation of individuals, need connection. Meaning like he's acknowledging that like that is part of our identities, that we're all these like hard, rugged, pull ourselves up by the bootstraps individuals, and the government needs to help kind of harness that. Oh, great. Okay, this is way more complicated than I thought it was going to be, or less complicated than I thought it was going to be. So I think my general argument, I'm going to just write out my super simplistic thesis statement, and I'll come back and refine it or add a new one in the conclusion later on. But I just want to get this idea out of my head. So by 1855, let's just say white American men had settled into a somewhat united national identity based on the ideas of freedom, hard work, and individualism. Great. So what I've done here is I have an answer. I'm saying, yeah, we did have a united national identity for white men. And then I'm also explaining my line of reasoning, which is what you need in a thesis. You need both. So I'm saying, and I'm going to argue that by saying like, oh, they all had these common ideas about being free and hardworking as an individual. And now that could just be my entire thesis, and I could just talk about those 4 documents and be done. I wouldn't get a 7 out of 7, but it'd be fine. I would get the thesis point for sure. I'm going to add my second part of my thesis to make it a little bit more complex, just because that's going to be my second group for like other documents I'm going to talk about. Maybe I'll say like even minority groups that were mostly left out of this common identity used similar ideas about freedom and equality, well, just freedom, hard work, and equality to argue that they should be more accepted as Americans. Okay, so that's my thesis. And I really kind of have 2 different thesis statements. I'm saying argument 1 is like, yeah, we had a common national identity for white men, and it was based around hard work, freedom, individualism, and that identity also pervaded, even if you were not a white man, if you were trying to get into the club, if you were trying to become part of the American identity, you would use that same language, those same arguments to be like, so that's why you should let me in too. So it actually strengthens my argument that this is the common identity. First, it's granted to white men, and then non-white men are going to be using it to try to push for acceptance too. Great. And here's what I'm going to do. That's going to be my whole introduction for now. I'm just like not going to worry about anything else yet. I want to get my basic ideas down. I want to get done with these documents. I want to make sure I like get it on the page, that I just like, right, get it off your chest, get it off my desk. Like, I just want to have it out there so that then I can go in and start doing the like harder stuff to think about. How could I contextualize? What other evidence could I bring in? That sort of thing. So again, don't overthink it. Just write a simplistic topic sentence, and it could be very similar to the thesis you just wrote. So paragraph 1 is going to be, from 1800 to 1855, a common national identity developed for white men that was based on the ideas of freedom, hard work, and individualism. Okay, now I'm just going to go through the documents, and you don't necessarily have to like really connect them together that well. I mean, I'm kind of grouping them, which is good. For one, by the end of this era, most white men could vote. I'm trying to say like the most clear sign of acceptance as a true American. Okay, document 1. I'm going to add in a little bit more detail, could vote regardless of property ownership. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to show the reader that I understood document 1. So I'm saying, okay, well, by the end of this era, most white men could vote regardless of property ownership. And then I'm saying, and that's like a really clear sign of being accepted as part of the identity, is you can vote. Okay, document 1. For now, I'm just going to move on. I can go back and add more in if I think so. Like maybe I want to add in another sentence or two, but for now, I just want to get the basics out there. Now I'm going to talk about document 2. During wartime, many citizens saw an attack on any sector of their nation or economy as an attack on all Americans. Document 2. So I'm just using enough here, like that's specific to make sure that they know I understand what document 2 is about. I'm going to look back at the document really quickly. So an attack on any sector of their nation, I'm going to just use a quote, lawful commerce, so that they know I'm like pulling from this document specifically, as an attack on all Americans, regardless of differing local interests. So again, I just want to put enough detail in here that the grader's like, I believe you. You're not just guessing at document 2, you understand what it's about. Now I'm going to just add a little note in here though. I'm going to say like POV. I want to add in here because there's some issues here of like, that doesn't mean that's what's happening. That's what the government is saying is happening. So I'm going to come back to it if I have time. Document 3. Okay. However, by the middle of this era, it was clear to, actually I don't need however, this supports my argument. By the end of this era, middle of this era, it was clear to President Madison that individualism and freedom would be key parts of the American identity that might also make it more difficult to rule at the national level. Admitting that, I'm trying to find like a little quote here. Okay, admitting that the US allows the art of man to kind of build their own life, and that state governments have typically taken the lead on building infrastructure, it would be important for the federal government to help unite these different individuals and state governments in some way. In this case, with trans-regional roads and canals. Not trans-regional, but like cross-state, interstate, that's what I'm looking for. Interstate roads and canals, document 3. Okay, so that's like a little bit meandering, but they'll understand what I mean. He's saying like, yeah, we're a nation of individualists. The state governments have done a lot of this stuff on their own, but I think we as the federal government need to build some of these bigger roads because we need to bind ourselves together. Great, okay. And then there's one last one. Document 6 I wanted to put in here, Emerson. It wasn't just politicians who saw the value of this growing national identity of hardworking individuals, free hardworking individuals. Even philosophers like Emerson recognized this as a major source of power for our nation. I think that's right. Let me go back and read this one more time. I think he's saying this is good. A nation of men will for the first time exist because each himself believes himself inspired by the divine soul. So he's saying we are going to be the first nation of men, truly an enlightened nation, a democratic nation, because we all are individuals who have come to believe that we control our own fate, we can do what we want. I don't think I'm misunderstanding this document. In yourself is the law of nature, in yourself. Okay. So Emerson believes the U.S. will become the first truly enlightened nation of men who have power over themselves. I'm trying to find something else here. I don't know why this document is throwing me off so much. Rather than the courtly muses of Europe. And I'm going to say because of our now common identity that each American freeman sees himself as rational, independent, free, and hardworking. Document 6. Okay, so I've just gone through those 4 documents really, really quickly to be like, hey, I understand what these are. And here's what's really cool is that I sit down and I say, okay, I've been working on this for like 25 minutes or so. So I'm less than halfway through my time. I feel confident that I've already earned the thesis point and I've already addressed 3 documents. So now I can take a deep breath and go, okay, I have 2 points. And this is what I mean by quality over quantity. Having 2 points and you're like only close to halfway through is a really good thing. Because remember, you don't need 7 out of 7. If I can get to a 4 or a 5, maybe a 6 in this time, I'll be really happy. I'm already at a 2. And I have just a few more documents to add to get up to a 3. And I feel like I'll be able to do that in my next body paragraph. Okay. So now next body paragraph is going to say, however, there were many groups of people who were left out of this initial national identity. In those previous documents, when referring to Americans, citizens, or freedmen, the authors really just meant white Christian men. But minority groups understood the power of the American identity enough to use it to argue for their own freedom and acceptance, period. All right, that's kind of my long-winded topic sentence. So now I'm going to look at documents 4, 5, and 7. Okay, the Cherokee Nation one is weird, but I think I understand it now. I'm going to say, like, even indigenous nations who had every reason in the world to distance themselves from the mainstream American identity attempted to adopt some elements into their own government. The Cherokee Constitution, for example, didn't go so far as to say that people could privately own property, but they did allow for ownership of, improvements made to the land. This, I don't know, capitalist approach, right? Like, I don't really know. This is clearly a nod to the growing American capitalist / individualistic attitude that people should be rewarded for their hard work and investments. By putting this allowance into their constitution, the Cherokee were attempting to get themselves closer to the common American identity, possibly to preserve the rest of their freedom. Document 4, and I'm going to put a note here of context. I think this would be a really good one to analyze, did that happen? Because I happen to know, as you probably do too, what happened to the Cherokee Nation a few years after 1827, and it has to do with Andrew Jackson and the Trail of Tears. So again, if I have time, I want to get through all the documents first, but if I have time, that'd be a good one to go back and evaluate that document a little bit more closely. And notice I'm doing this because I'm typing where I'm just leaving space. Hey, write about point of view here. If you're handwriting, you don't have to worry about it. You could still make a note to yourself. The College Board, the graders are totally fine with reading long arrows of hey, read this part right up here. Or if at the end you decide, okay, I want to go back and analyze some more, you can just analyze some more. Basically, it doesn't have to be perfectly organized. The graders read this understanding that it's a rough draft for you, and so they'll do their best to figure it all out. If you're typing, it makes it a little bit easier, but if you're handwriting, don't worry. You're more than welcome to just squeeze something in or just start a whole new paragraph at the end and be like, back to document 2. It's totally fine. It's not going to be neat, but it's okay. All right, now we need to look at document 5. A free Black woman goes even further, connecting the goals of Black Americans for freedom and equality with the Pilgrims and the Founding Fathers. What's her name again? Maria Stewart is drawing upon the narrative that Americans came here because they were more independent. What's another word besides hardworking? What? Oh my gosh, they were more independent, entrepreneurial, or free-spirited than people back home in England. With that common identity acknowledged, Stewart explains that it makes perfect sense that Black Americans would also be seeking freedom, independence, and a chance to make something of themselves. In fact, by demanding those freedoms, including abolition, Black Americans are proving that they are already part of the national identity, period. I don't know if that makes perfect sense, but I'm gonna leave it there. All right, and then the last document is document 7, right? Go get education. This one I'm like, what does this have to do with national identity? Like, because is he using any language here that's talking about, I mean, he's basically saying if women are free, then they can do everything a man can do. So, women's rights activists, I'm gonna put it similarly, women's rights activists argued that the only thing keeping women from proving they were equal to men was the despotism of brute force that was keeping them down by men. Document 7. I just realized I don't think I cited document 5 yet, which, just to be clear, if you get through, okay, document 5. So if you get through and you're like, oh my gosh, I forgot to write document 5 at the end of one, it's okay. Honestly, it should be clear enough to the reader. If the reader is reading your analysis and can't figure out what document you're referring to, then you haven't done enough anyway. So if you forget to cite a specific document, it's probably totally fine. You want to try to do it because it just makes it easier for the grader, but don't panic if you turn it in and go, oh, I forgot to write document 1 on this one. It's going to be okay. So women's rights activists argued that the only thing keeping women from proving they were equal to men was the despotism of brute force that was keeping them down by men. Again, advocates for women's education are using the argument that women should be equally part of the national identity by being given the opportunity to learn and advance themselves and prove, I need to link it back to what I've already said is the identity because I'm getting off on a little tangent here, and to learn and advance themselves and prove themselves hardworking individuals. So notice, like, if you find yourself getting off on tangents, like I sometimes do, I realized like I hadn't referred back to my original argument in a long time. So don't forget about that, especially as you're finishing up explaining a document or finishing up with the body paragraph. Maybe go back and remind yourself of what the prompt was. Like for me, I'm arguing that the common identity is like free, hardworking individuals. And I realized in this paragraph, I'd kind of gotten off a little bit. And so I don't need to like undo it. I just need to bring it back and say, okay, so women are saying we need education because that will make us free, hardworking individuals. Black people are saying we need freedom and we need equality because that will allow us to prove we're free, hardworking individuals. Same thing with the Cherokee, like, hey, leave us alone because we're also free, hardworking individuals that just happen to share common land. So again, bringing it back to even using some of the same words again that you used up in your thesis or earlier in your argument is always a good thing, just to like remind the grader like what point you're trying to make. So at this point, I've earned thesis, I've addressed 3 documents, but now I've actually used all 7 documents. So even if I got one of those wrong, like if I misread one of these documents, I'm okay because I just have to have 6. So I already have a 3. I'm trying to think about, there's 2 points I could get in the last like 15-ish minutes or so. Context, additional evidence. I mean, context to me, especially in American history, seems pretty easy because you can just go chronologically. So for context, we could just talk about what was happening. I mean, we talk about the revolution, right? And all men are created equal. That would be our context, right? Because it's before 1800, but it clearly explains why we got here, why like white Americans at least believe that like they do all deserve equality. So the United States was founded, I'm actually going to go back to the colonies. The United States was founded originally for 2 main reasons: religious freedom. I'm going to oversimplify. I don't think that's actually true, but religious freedom and economic opportunity. In New England, many Protestants came from Europe looking for a place to live and practice their religion more freely. Similarly, in Jamestown, many white men crossed the ocean, maybe a little poetic here, because they didn't have opportunities back home to get rich because of their birth or status. But in America, the belief grew that anyone could make it here and become a free, hardworking individual in a land of opportunity. Okay, that's my context. I'm explaining like how that idea became so pervasive. Well, because it kind of was, right? In the colonies, like that's sort of what they represented to white people, right? Now, I'm just going to say it's important to note that America was only seen as a land of opportunity mostly for white men. Enslaved Africans, subjugated indigenous people, and other historically marginalized groups might have believed in this national identity, even if it wasn't available to them. So what I'm doing is I'm kind of preparing them for my argument. That's like, hey, the national identity is free, hardworking individuals. It's granted fairly easily to white men. It has to be fought for by other groups, right? And so that's why I sometimes like to do context later, because a lot of times you will sit here and struggle for context. You can't really figure out the context until you actually know what you're going to argue, right? Because that you want to make sure the context relates. You don't want to just give a random fun fact. So I feel like now that does a good job of explaining like where this idea comes from. And honestly, I wouldn't have thought of that if I'd started it at the beginning, because to be totally honest, I wasn't quite sure what I was explaining until like halfway through the first body paragraph. So now it makes it a little bit easier to go and think of like one really specific thing you can focus on. And again, quality over quantity. Notice I'm not listing out a ton of different pieces of context. I'm focusing on like 1 or 2 things. Hey, why did people come here? For religious freedom, for economic opportunity. Great. Now I'm going to really fully explain to you why that's important and how that leads us to the thesis. Quality over quantity. You don't need to just list out every single fact that you know about the colonies or every single fact you know that could be context for this. It's way better to pick 1 or 2 things and go in depth, make sure the reader is like, okay, I believe you. It's overkill. You know what you're talking about. So now I feel pretty good that I have context and I'm up to a 4. For now, I want to think about additional evidence. Additional evidence can either be a really easy point or a really hard point, and it kind of just depends on how much you know. So what I'm trying to think of is if I can think of one other specific thing that would relate to, Andrew Jackson. Done. The common man. There's nothing in here about that. Great. So again, what you're trying to think about is not just like a fun fact in addition to a document. So not like a fun fact about Ralph Waldo Emerson or whatever, but you're trying to think about like a whole other topic that could have been document 8. It could have been an 8th document about another point related to this. So I'm gonna throw that in this first paragraph. The epitome of this national identity came with the election of Andrew Jackson to the presidency. Born and raised on the frontier, Jackson was the poster child for the common man who rose up through his own hard work and became the most powerful individual in the United States. Okay. Now, I think that's enough. Like him being elected, he was the common man. I specifically said he was raised on the frontier, which kind of explains that. But I actually think this could actually serve too as like a good tie-in to the next paragraph. Jackson is actually a perfect example of the common national identity of this era because he excludes non-white people. His White House, let's say, that is meant to be open for all Americans, in fact, only really represents white men. Okay, I think that's fine. I don't necessarily need that. I'm just trying to like do a little transition. And that's where here for the Cherokee thing, that would be actually really helpful context I can tie back to Andrew Jackson. So, okay, I have about 10 minutes left. I feel pretty good. I have a 5, but let's just say like, okay, maybe I screwed something up and I don't, and I have a 4. Let me just think about how I would HIPP, if I can HIPP these last 3 documents in the last 10 minutes or so. So there's 2 that already came kind of naturally to me. So I'm gonna do the Andrew Jackson one first because that's just like fresh in my brain. I'm just gonna start a new paragraph because some of these are getting really long. So the Cherokee, okay. It's important to note that this is a really good sentence starter for evaluating a document, HIPPing it, talking about like the point of view or the intended audience, instead of just being like the point of view is of this person. I think a really helpful sentence starter is it's important to note that something, because that gets your brain into like the analytical space where you're like, hey, I'm going to tell you why it's important that we notice this thing. It's important to note that Cherokee land was not honored by white Americans in the years directly after this Constitution was passed, even though the Supreme Court argued that the Cherokee had their right to their ancestral land. White settlers, inspired and often actively encouraged by President Jackson, flooded into Cherokee land to transform it into privately owned, prosperous individual farms and plantations. So I'm saying that because I want to, again, connect it back to the identity of like, our identity is like, we're individuals, we own things on our own, we can work the land on our own, whatever. Unfortunately, the Cherokee Nation was not accepted into the national identity of the times. In fact, they were sent, basically forced on a death march to new territory out west. Okay, so that to me I think is evaluating the document, but I'm gonna be totally honest, if I don't get it for evaluating the document, that could be an additional piece of evidence. So this is a good thing, is if you keep everything kind of within the topic of your prompt, like I'm not gonna go way back in time, I'm not gonna go talk about something totally random. I think this could count for like evaluating kind of the historical situation of document 4. Like, hey, I'm telling you, I know that this Constitution was passed in 1927 and just a few years later is gonna be the Trail of Tears. And I know that, and that's important to note. But even if they don't count it for that, this could be another example of additional evidence of me, because I tied it back to my argument. I didn't just say, hey, fun fact or not so fun fact, this is what's going to happen to them. I really clearly tied it back to my overall argument about national identity and who's accepted. That means that like it's going to get me something either way. Either it gets me one of the documents closer to like evaluating that point, or it like secures that I have additional evidence and get that other point. Everything you're writing should then tie back to the argument you're making, just in case, because you don't have to decide what point it's going to count for. The reader gets to decide. So I might think that's context, but they might think it's additional evidence. Either way, it's a point for me. All right, let me see if I can really quickly do two more in the time frame. So point of view, I said during wartime. Oh, citizens. Okay. It's important to note that this argument came in an official government document justifying the upcoming war with England. We know that actually not all Americans were united in attitude about the War of 1812. Famously, the Federalist Party broke down because of its opposition to the war. And even though the impressment of sailors was a major rallying cry to motivate people to fight England, the war was just as much about indigenous attacks on the frontier. However, it's easier to fight and win a war as the government if your people are united against a simple cause. So this document was partly made to explain, to convince American citizens and soldiers that they should all be united in this war, even if they aren't. Great. So that's like purpose and kind of intended audience and purpose. Okay, well, let me look at if there's one more that would be helpful. And again, like you don't necessarily have to do this. Maps are always really hard to HIPP. I wouldn't necessarily do that. President James Madison is going to be kind of similar to what I just said. The Cherokee I already did. These documents are really cool. Ralph Waldo Emerson. I know a lot about him. Transcendentalism. I could talk about transcendentalism a little bit. It's document 6. Emerson was one of the most famous figures within the transcendentalist movement. This kind of Enlightenment inspired movement, whatever, encouraged individualism along with an appreciation of the natural beauty of the environment. However, many transcendentalists, I think like Emerson, used this movement to help fight for expanding the rights of marginalized groups. Many transcendentalists were also abolitionists and women's rights advocates. So Emerson's version of American individualism is slightly different than that of the US government, who sees individualism as a benefit for economic growth. I don't know if that's great. I don't know if I'd get the point for that, I'm gonna be totally honest. Again, if nothing else, I get additional evidence. But what I'm trying to say is like, hey, yeah, Emerson, it's weird. Basically what I'm trying to say is like, it's weird that I've lumped Emerson in with like Andrew Jackson and the War of 1812, because Emerson and the Transcendentalists were way more kind of like hippies. And so I'm trying to kind of argue that like, hey, I understand though that like his argument for why individualism is good, it's because it's going to spark more freedom for more people. I might add something in here. So Emerson's version of American individualism is in pursuit of the highest form of American identity, freedom. This is slightly different than that of the US government, who sees individualism as a benefit for economic growth. Okay, I'm gonna stop. I'm just like not even gonna think about it. My time is basically up. A few things that I want you to notice is that you can do this strategy however you want. If you have a way that you've set up to write these DBQs that has already worked for you, then keep doing it. But if you are one of those people who stares at an empty page and freaks out for like 20 minutes before you start writing, I would adopt this strategy. Do it piecemeal. What you're doing is you're basically Frankensteining an essay together. You're gonna say, okay, I'm panicking, but let's say you get to where you understand 3 of the 7 documents. Great, start with those 3. Literally just go through and be like, document 1 says this, document 4 shows us this, document 5 shows us this, and you get that 1 point. Then see if you can go back and make a thesis out of that. Great. Then see if you can go back and add context. Like, you're not gonna sit down and like get this essay sent into your brain fully formed. You're probably, because it's fast, I mean, that's a short hour, right? It's fast. You're going to have to just like get in there and start writing, even if it's a little bit hodgepodge and all over the place. Again, if you're handwriting, it's okay, right? What I would probably do here is before I started my thesis, I would leave a few lines and go, I'm probably going to come back and write context there. Worst case, if I don't get to it, there's just a few blank lines. That's totally fine. You're not going to get in trouble for that, right? Same thing at the end of each paragraph, I might leave a few lines in case I want to like insert something else in there. But worst case, you can literally just like tack on. If I wanted to go into a whole thing about Andrew Jackson, but I didn't have any room anywhere else, I could just throw it into a whole other paragraph and it might be totally out of order, and it's okay. They will read everything you write and they will do their best to get you as many points as possible. Okay, so I feel very confident that I just wrote a 5. I might have written a 6, but those HIPPs were like, I did them really fast. So I could have written a 6. I definitely wrote a 5. I'm not worried about complexity at all. If someone finds this essay complex, great. But that's something that I can't really plan for. And there's really not a lot that you can do to like force complexity in there. It just sort of either comes or it doesn't. So complexity is really the one, I think, kind of subjective point where the grader is going to be grading you kind of compared to all the other essays. If the grader who were to grade this had read a bunch of like terrible essays before that like couldn't really talk about any of this stuff, then all of a sudden they might go, wow, this essay is pretty complex. But if not, if a lot of people are crushing this essay, they might go, yeah, that's pretty standard. So again, don't worry about complexity. Don't shoot for complexity. Try to get, let's say, 5 points. And that way, if you screw up, you maybe still get a 3 or a 4. And then again, I looked up and I kind of thought I was done. And then I was like, well, I have just enough time left. I'll try to cram in some of this HIPP just to see. Maybe I got myself another point. Maybe I didn't. All right, if this was helpful, like and subscribe. Make sure that you check out all my review materials. I have an APUSH review packet for students. I have the same thing for AP World. It's all linked in the description. Good luck. Good luck on your DBQ. Oh, I hate that I just made myself do this. All right.